Thanks, Scott. I wanted to talk a little bit about today the technical services and how important those are and how those kind of play within our platform and the way they work with regards to the dynamic CI group and the application services.
Great.
Just to kind of add some color, I'm finding this to be a really important step for folks. I know we have it on our crawl, walk, run, fly methodology. And when we talk about the crawl part, I think people mostly get this. Most of the folks are just moving the discoverable application into the right tables at the business app level, establishing app services for the first time potentially, but they're just getting the conceptual, logical, physical tier of the model kind of straightened out. When we get to the technical services, what I find is that there's a couple of things with regards to defining these technical services, the offerings in the dynamic CI group, and how those relate to the underlying discoverable piece parts. That's pretty important and very, I would say, foundational for how customers need to think about and evolve their services portfolio, which is now also an option.
Agreed. I also think it's the easiest introduction of identifying what the services are inside of an organization, especially when we talk to IT people and we ask, what are the services that you care about? Usually those IT people start talking about IT services, and specifically the people that are responsible for providing and the care and feeding of the technology. So this becomes one of the simpler services to start to build out and understand.
Yeah, and I've also heard them called shared services or foundational services, IT services. There's a bunch of names that are used typically, but that's kind of what we're talking about here, right?
Correct.
Okay. So in here, we've got three different types of technical services in our diagram. And I want to just take a moment and just clarify what we mean by all three, because they're here. Of course, we need to cover the bases when we're talking technical services. So why don't you provide me a quick overview?
Sure, we'll start at the top. So I think one of the simplest ones to focus on is the application service owner. So that would be the various teams that are responsible for the applications and the instances of those applications that are deployed inside of an organization. And so whether or not that's a team that oversees multiple applications and their implementations, or if it's a team that's focused on one particular application, that just becomes essentially, what are those teams? I like to tell folks when they get started is think about where you have support groups set up for your various applications. Whether you have a handful of support groups or a lot of them based off of individual application services, the instances, that helps you to determine your technical service offerings, because that's really what's the team that's responsible for this particular instance or instances of an application. And so that becomes the quantity approximately of what you need for technical services. And that, again, is specific to the folks that take care of the applications or the platforms that are in an environment. We want to make sure we talk about the platforms as well, especially from a shared service perspective, because the platform is just as important as the applications that run on or within those particular platforms.
Yeah, I often think about these guys as really the building blocks, right? They understand an application and they're providing services which other folks will consume more in a technical manner, right? It's especially like the platform, right? A platform by itself doesn't do anything. You have to configure stuff or deploy things on the platform, and that's more or less a technology consumer.
And by having that technical service offering for that application team, they then have an object that is theirs. And then everything that is related to it, all those application service, becomes the objects that they have responsibility to. And it's easier to manage all of the information about that team, as well as any sort of KPIs associated to their services on that one record, as opposed to trying to manage it uniquely on multiple CIs inside of the instance.
Okay, so your team basically has a new home. They can define their technical service, the offerings, SLA, OLA commitments, and then what instances of their apps or application services, or we sometimes also call them systems, that they are responsible for. Is that correct?
That is correct. One nuance in this space, in the application service space, is that technical service offering for applications, you might have two pieces to those technical service offerings. And I say that because of any sort of commitments or any sort of criticality that you put on that service offering. And that relates to the environments of applications. So you might have a different criticality for the prod instances that you take care of, different from dev and QA. So that way you might have a technical service offering, say the team that takes care of ServiceNow. You would have a technical service offering for the prod instance of ServiceNow and all of the criticality and SLAs associated with that, or SLOs. And then separately a technical service offering for the non-prods, whatever they are. Not saying one for each type of environment, but one that encompasses all of the non-production instances. So you still know who's responsible for those particular instances. And that helps you to kind of micromanage the performance and the KPIs associated with those various services.
Right. So anything fails, right, they'll be informed up through this route, basically.
Correct.
Yeah.
I like to call that section of the managed technical services the people who provide and maintain the technology, and this layer focused on the applications.
Right. And you don't need a business service. These are mutual exclusive. You can define this and not this, or the other way around as well.
Especially when we start talking about a shared service. So
Yeah.
for example, a platform that is shared between multiple applications. Those applications might have a business service that uses it, but the platform it runs on isn't necessarily business facing. It's just a shared service that's provided inside of the technology environment. So there's no requirement that an application service has to directly have a link to a business service. It could just be through a hierarchy eventually gets there.
Yeah. So there could be app services on top of this that depend on this common platform.
Correct.
The platform itself doesn't provide a business service, but the app services on top of it do.
Correct.
Yeah.
And
Excellent.
another example of that, we'll just use ServiceNow. ServiceNow is a platform, yet the functionality of performing HR inside of the platform, you would have two different application services, one for the platform and one for HR. And that way HR would be pointing to its business services, but HR runs on the platform of ServiceNow, and so it wouldn't have a direct business service.
Yeah. Yeah. So HR would sit on top of the common platform. And this is one of the examples that we talk about. We'll put a link in here as well so folks can get to those examples.
Great.
Excellent. So that kind of covers the first level, right? So we kind of covered off of this one. Now, what about the second one here, where we have the dynamic CI group involved?
So we like to call this the infrastructure. And the infrastructure isn't just hardware. This is also the middleware. And from a cloud perspective, it's also your cloud instances. So for those application services or systems to function, they are connected and hosted in some manner. So it's all of those pieces from that connection standpoint, the hosting standpoint, as well as the network, that get identified as the various layers that exist in order for that application service or system to exist. If we look at each of those layers, stratify those out, chances are we've got teams that are responsible for those various layers. And let's just assume in the application layer, we might have a database. And so in that layer, we want to make sure we identify who's the team responsible for that or those databases. It could be the entire Oracle team or the entire Microsoft SQL team, or a team that's responsible for the Oracle databases in a particular region. However it's broken up, again, looking at the support groups that are responsible for managing and maintaining the databases, let's create a technical service offering that's for those groupings. In this example, databases, and make sure that we have that view for what they were responsible for. And that team then has an object to identify what are all the pieces I'm responsible for and how are we performing, how many outages or incidents or changes do we perform, how is my overall KPIs. And then other teams get to look and see what services they rely on. And so from the top section, the application team can know, hey, I'm relying on a database service. This is the specific database. And then this is the service team that's responsible for providing it. And so you get more details to the stratification, the various layers of technology that exist in order to provide that application. So the database layer, the hosting layer, whether it's on-prem or in the cloud, who's responsible for that hosting, any sort of networking that's associated to it. Things that would normally be found from a service mapping and discovery perspective are those layers that we want to make sure we identify. None of the infrastructure in a perfect scenario should exist without knowing who's responsible for providing it and maintaining it. And those layers are the technical service offerings, who provides it and maintains it.
Yeah, there's a couple things that really kind of I find resonates for folks. One of the things that it's really powerful is there's a query here. And so you can query all the network gear, or say, only the network gear in this data center is kind of going to this group, which is different than the one that manages a different data center. So you can kind of set up that query to match up with what they particularly own in that offering.
Anything that we can use as a data element to query, we can use then to group CIs. And then in that grouping of CIs and that dynamic query perspective, then we can tie it to that technical service offering. In the old days, we had to manually do all those relationships, and no one ever enjoyed doing that. So now by using the queries, we make this so much easier.
Yeah. Yeah. And sometimes I know that some folks will use a different product that might do it at the CI class owner level. Yeah, any words about the class ownership versus the query approach? Because I find queries a little bit more flexible, really.
They're designed to be more flexible. From a class perspective, the goal was just to be able to do a default. So from a class perspective, let's identify the responsibility and where that management should be. But that was just so that if something gets discovered brand new, we at least had a name or a group to associate to that new object that was discovered, as opposed to having nothing. So it's kind of the backup default of what can be identified just through an overall class view. But what we ultimately get to as soon as we start moving into that walk stage is really getting into the identification of the teams that are responsible and giving them a technical service offering object that represents them and expectations so that we can then associate those pieces. That allows us to, as you said, use queries to break that down even further. And it's actually designed in a manner to override the generic view from a class perspective. So it becomes layering. If there's nothing known from a technical service offering and a dynamic query, then at a minimum, we'll go with the class view of ownership. But if we do know based off of that query who the owner is, because it made it into one of those dynamic queries and then can be tied to a technical service offering, then of course we want to be more finite and I understand exactly who's responsible as opposed to more generic for an entire class.
Yeah, so I can put some catch-alls at the class level. So if a new thing shows up that we've never seen before, as long as it's classified as hardware, for example, you'll get some ownership that can look at it.
Correct.
And if these queries need to be adjusted, of course, then they can start accounting for this new thing that shows up.
And ownership is never something you can easily discover. So we've always had that ask whenever we went in and worked with customers about fixing data. One of the top pieces is they don't know who owns the data. This allows us to at least categorize the data and put some ownership based off of categorizations and classes as a stopgap.
Yeah. So I'm going to switch gears here real quick, and I'm just going to show what this looks like in the service builder. So just coming back to how we do this within the platform, this is the nice new service builder that came out in Rome to create a business service and or a technical service and define some of those things that we're talking about in a nice, methodic way, including the offering. A lot of folks say, well, how do I create an offering? Well, it's just part of the service builder. If you use it, there you go. There's your offering. You're going to define it, and there you're going to have that as part of the process. And the thing I like about this is that you don't have to worry about what relationships you're dealing with. You just go down through the process. And just a quick word on service classification, will you? Because I know that does show up here and there. I know that we want to get away from it. So what's your take on that, and what should people do?
So this is a legacy piece where on the core service table is this service classification. And this is back in the days where all services shared the same table inside of ServiceNow. Over the past few years, we've started to take what we identify as the classifications and made them extended tables, dedicated tables. So we have a dedicated technical service table. We now have a dedicated business service table. So the need for that service classification is going away. It's not all being shared in the same table. Now they're living in their own table, and the name and function of that table is that classification. So that is the history and the legacy of the attribute. But not all customers have migrated into the new tables yet. And many of them are still in the same shared table at the core of services. So this is an attribute that, although it's legacy, is going to stick around a little bit longer until we get everyone migrated into the new system of dedicated services. And then we won't have to have this particular service classification anymore. There is a piece that would exist from a service offering view, but we're looking at ways of deprecating that need as well.
Yeah. Yeah. And the thing that I noticed too, by using this user experience, it automatically sets everything up so you don't have to worry about, doing the right classification.
I mean, you don't have to be
Here,
an expert in the data to know exactly
yes.
what you know.
Well, our goal, Scott, is to hide that complexity, right? People should never have to learn the data model. It
I
just
agree.
happens.
I
Yeah.
would love to have not had to memorize every aspect of the data model.
Yes. But okay, so when you're defining the service, you have certain elements you can define in terms of ownership, but we don't have support group here. And that's what we get to in the offering definition. As you continue down this path, you deal with performance, you set up your KPIs associated with this at the service level. You manage the offerings, you create the offerings. So it's creating these objects in the background. I don't have to think about it. When I create it, the right relationship is set up, the right offering type with the technical service classification is set up, and you can give it its own unique name as part of this service.
Now, the
And
reason why the technical service was automatically filled in is because this offering is tied to a service which was previously classified as a technical service. So the
yeah,
assumption is that the offerings of a service need to be the same classification. You wouldn't suddenly have a business service offering hanging off of a technical service. So that's why it fills in for you based off of the type of service you started out with.
so it keeps you in line. You can't make a mistake.
Correct.
And so we have things like business criticality on the offering and things like this. The team, this is where we define things like the support group. Do you want to talk a little bit about the support group, manage my group, and
Group is the
change
other.
group? That's right. Yeah.
So we wanted to make sure we had consistency as to the various groups that we reference. And in the past, we haven't had that consistency. There's been some group attributes that, depending on the customer or depending on the scenario, might be used in different manners. But we wanted to drive consistency so that we can then have the right data at the right time for all of the various products using the platform. So support group is intended to be used for incident. So it is who we would do the routing for in case of an incident. So for a particular CI, identifying who is responsible for the care and feeding is the support group, and primarily to be used inside of the incident process.
So this will be used later on when incidents are created for anything that is underneath this offering, right? Anything related to it.
So that was the
That's
other
the idea.
benefit. By managing this at the service offering level, then the assumption that we enforce is that that's the same support group for all of the CIs that this offering is taken care of.
Right.
And so taking the value that's entered here under support group and essentially synchronizing it down onto all of those CIs that they oversee, making it simpler to manage the CMDB and the CIs in the CMDB, less manual, more automation.
Yeah. What we're saying is that we're adding that value at the offering level, right? And then it will get propagated down this level, as we had highlighted before.
Correct. And that's probably one of the top asks. Because again, anyone who's managed a CMDB, and especially the ones that fail, it's because there's too much manual activity to maintain a CMDB. So the more automation we can do with data, then the easier it is to maintain those objects. So that's really where the concept of a technical service offering came from. There was a European business that decided that they didn't want any infrastructure CI to exist without it being identified to a technical service offering that showed who was responsible for it. And they made that a company-wide mandate in their ServiceNow implementation. And it worked. It worked extremely well. And so we've adopted that as a consistent best practice.
Yeah, so the goal is every CI here will be related to one, and no more than one really offering, because then you would have multiple owners or multiple SLAs. What do you do?
Correct.
Excellent.
Now this overall system of creating a service, I mean, compare this to the old days. So Mark, you and I in the old knowledge labs manually go in and create an individual CI, and there's requirements of creating a parent CI and making sure you create that and then select the proper relationship. Being able to just come in here and use this wizard to set everything up is so much easier than trying to be an expert in the CMDB and the data model and knowing where things have to exist. This just takes care of it for you.
Absolutely. And one of the things that's really great about some of our other product teams is like they're listening, because now that I've defined the offering, what is the next thing I need to define? Oh, well, it's the dynamic CI group. It's the application service. So that would be nice to add as another step here. And I think, the teams here are willing to listen and add those things as we mature the use of CSDM as the model to go to.
Agreed. And then the time to value just is improved across the board.
Yeah, I mean, this is a breeze, right? I mean, you could federate the ownership and the responsibility to the folks that own these services, right? You don't have to do it for them. So now that we can easily define these two levels, right? The next thing we need to understand is sort of how to set up that dynamic CI group. And this is another hot topic. It's very powerful with that query that we just kind of walked through. What I find is that folks don't know how easy it is to set these up. So we have dynamic CI groups. Okay, so I want to talk a little about the dynamic CI group itself and what folks need to go through to do this. Because I find that people aren't aware of them. I know we've got some tutorials out there here and there, but it's pretty easy to set up. And I know we can set up some other metadata on the dynamic CI group. And I noticed this is used also to define some application services as well.
Yeah, there's two manners of having a dynamic CI group, and it goes back to a service classification.
Yeah.
Is this going to be used for technology and infrastructure, or is this going to be used as an application? So it becomes another method of identifying what CIs are representative of this application instance or system. And so instead of having service mapping, if that's not available, or instead of having tag-based mapping, if that's not available, you can just use a query. And so based off of having a query and what falls into that query, everything that then falls into that query becomes part of this, and it will act as an application service, but uses a query to create all of its objects.
Right, right. More flexibility in how you actually populate that app service.
Right. Think of it as the replacement for spreadsheets. So those scenarios where, hey, I have an application and we use a spreadsheet that says these 10 servers are part of it. Well, instead of having the spreadsheet, let's create a query that either specifically identifies those 10 servers, or if there's some data element that allows us to use a query to get to those 10 servers, let's do that instead. And now it lives inside of ServiceNow and we can get rid of those spreadsheets.
Yep, yep. And there's only a few steps. I like to start here with the dynamic CI group itself. We also have to define a CMDB group, which is, I guess, legacy, right? This has been around a long time.
It is, but it's being used in multiple places. So it's where queries are stored from the query builder. And so we use it in other areas inside the platform. So instead of recreating this inside of dynamic CI group, let's just utilize what already exists.
Right. So I can create my new group and define sort of what it does after I submit this. I can kind of.
Services year one, yeah.
Okay, so my new group, there it is. So we come back here and then we can go into the particular record and look at the CMDB group, define sort of its contents through CMDB, create a new query, encoded query, or just manually add items.
So that was that reference where you can just pull existing CIs to say they're part of it. So that replaces your spreadsheet, or as I mentioned, create a query to get to those same objects.
Yeah, of course, there's some limitations on this kind of query. This is the CMDB query. You're sort of limited to 10,000 records. Is that right? That's kind of
by default, yes.
Yeah.
Can work through moving beyond that, but beyond that is where you start impacting performance on the platform. So it's not that forever and always it can only be 10,000, but anything beyond that we want to essentially review and make sure we're not impacting the performance if we move beyond that number.
Yeah, if you do like a simple class-based query, then it shouldn't be too bad.
Correct.
Yeah, it's more complex queries that you run into issues. And then, of course, you can do just a normal encoded query, which is your old style queries. So that's kind of how you create those dynamic CI groups to be able to connect the dots all the way down into the underlying CIs.
And it's such a saver.
Yeah. Now, once you get this connected, right, this is where the magic can happen. I wanted to share a little bit about what happens in the background once this is connected. So let me jump to DocSite. So one of my favorite things is you got this new feature, synchronizing group assignments attributes, and you can kind of do it like we talked about through the CI class and technical service offering. And then, of course, if you do it through the technical service offering, it's going to leverage what we just set up. And this kind of talks a little bit about how to set those dynamic CI groups up. But I think there's a couple of interesting things here. So these are the three groups that are propagated, right? That's correct? The support group, change group, and management,
which is used for incident, change group, which is used for change, and then managed by group, which essentially we identify as the group that's responsible for that CI and the data on that CI.
Yeah. Now, some folks ask me about whether they can customize that. Can they add more?
Not at this time. Again, there is a hit to the platform to properly take this data and propagate it and synchronize it down to the CIs. But even more than that is making sure that we have the right data at the right moment. So if a CI is no longer part of a particular dynamic CI group, then that data is removed. And if there's any data such as the managed by group identified at the class level, then the class level data overrides that individual data element. So there's a lot of other material that's going on in the background to make sure that the data is accurate, not just the one-time synchronization when you initially set it up, but that it remains accurate ongoing. And for that reason, a lot of the activity that is done isn't able to be easily added to.
Yeah, yeah. The good thing is it kind of hits on that. You can immediately go to the navigator and kick off the actual data sync job to see the results, right? That'll kick it off in the background and fill it in.
Yeah, there's multiple layers that are going on in the background to make sure that the data gets synchronized at all the proper levels or unsynchronized, depending on the scenario.
And of course, people need to enable that scheduled job. Is that enabled by default?
It is not enabled by default, so you do have to turn it on.
Okay, Scott, well, I think we kind of covered the use case for the infrastructure level technical services is really good. So we've kind of done these two. What's the last one? What do we have here?
So that's a good question. This is where we get a lot of questions. Obviously, the pieces above is where we've got actual technology involved with a dependency. I'm either taking care of applications or I'm taking care of infrastructure. So there's something tied to that technical service offering that you're responsible for from a support perspective.
Yeah.
In this scenario, there's nothing tied to it. So you're not responsible for an application. You're not responsible for any sort of infrastructure. Instead, you're truly providing a delivery service. One of the scenarios as documented from the various standards is, for example, hey, I need help with the creation of an application. They're not going to be responsible for maintaining it, but they can provide services to help create things. And so in the IT space, where do you have teams that are responsible to help others and deliver assistance, but they aren't the ones that are dependent on or providing particular infrastructure? So that's where this comes into play. It's not that it's exceptionally common, but we just wanted to make sure we had that scenario of what about those IT teams that provide a service, but they don't take care of any technology.
It's more or less labor. They're doing a job and we're accounting for it, but it doesn't necessarily connect to something.
And there's a cost associated to that labor. So we want to know that we provide that service and that we know that can be requested from a catalog perspective, but there isn't actually any technology that comes with it.
Yeah, it's interesting because we have this term, digital service. These are digital service. These are manual ones, right? Use a manual labor doing all the work versus there, I'm giving you something digital at the end of the day. Of course, they're all connected to the service offering. One of the things we didn't look at in the offering definition is what catalog item they connect to. I think that's really important too, from a self-service point of view.
That way, from a service ownership perspective, you start to see where the demand is for the various services and see that demand over time and understand where you may or may not have demand for the various services. So tying those two catalog items, which then are inside of the service catalog that can be requestable, that helps you just tie those pieces together as opposed to having to build this all separate and one can't speak to the other. This actually pulls the data in so you can view it from a service ownership perspective.
Yeah, and what I've also been able to describe is the fact that somebody might expose a catalog item to add, let's say, a new server. And so going through that process kicks off. Maybe it's even completely automated from a virtual containers, virtual server perspective. It gets added as a new CI. And because the query is there, it automatically gets picked up and it's related to the right group and everything. And these guys can start to use their new server and have support for it already kind of set up.
And the other value of that, because of that query, is you don't have to write into that workflow exactly where ownership goes in the future. You let the query take care of that for you.
Yeah, I think that's the perfect thing because these are what we call standard services or standard changes where we have a known set of support organizations to do things and everything's sort of tied in once it's been delivered.
And it takes the manual intervention away from that workflow to determine where that needs to relate in the future. When we implemented those in the field, they were always difficult to implement. Any manual workflow is difficult. So the more automation we can do here, the better.
Yeah, so they can basically use our standard catalog features define these items, associate them with the offerings, automate whatever the process is, or have approvals or whatever it is. Everything's tied together. We used to call this request to fulfill, by the way. So request and then fulfill, and the automation comes in. And of course, I know what I fulfilled. Well, thanks, Scott. Thanks for tackling the technical services area. This is a hot topic with all the things and the level of detail we kind of covered, how products support this. I'm sure we'll be back and cover another topic next.
Always happy to help.